Here we go.
Well, welcome once again. We're just so pleased that even at this late time of the school year, that there are people who found the time and the energy to join us. It has been a very long year, considering all the ups and downs that we've had in a second year of the coronavirus pandemic. So welcome, everyone. My name is Eva de Gosztonyi. I'm a psychologist and the coordinator of the Centre of Excellence for Behaviour Management, which is a support to the 10 English school boards of Quebec. And I have my co-coordinator with me, Catherine Cora.
Hello, everybody. I'm also the co-coordinator of the Centre of Excellence for Behaviour Management and been at Riverside for quite a few years now and English Montreal before then. So welcome.
Yes. So we're going to talk today about the highly sensitive child in the classroom. And it's very interesting, as Catherine and I were preparing this presentation, we realized that actually everything that we've been saying up to now about the children that have been manifesting different kinds of problems, the ones with problems with, attacking energy, the ones that are defended, the ones that are highly alarmed, the ones with the attention problems, every one of those students could potentially be one of these students as well. It's possibly sort of an underlying factor in perhaps why they have reacted more strongly to environmental factors, responded so strongly to what is happening in their life with certain kinds of behaviors. And so today we're going to lay the groundwork and give you the background about what we mean by a highly sensitive child. And then we're going to share some of the research that goes with that, some of the factors that are included when we talk about this high sensitivity. And then we'll allude to some interventions that you can do, some that are going to be more specific to the particular issues that most of these children face. But also want to let you know that really, if you want to get the whole kind of gamut of what we recommend in terms of interventions, you'll probably need to go back, and we've provided a resource list of where you can find recordings on the other topics as well. So it's hard in 1 hour to present everything that needs to be presented, but we're adding, I think, layers and pieces to the puzzle so that bit by bit you start to see what it is that could be leading a child to having problems with their behavior that are a challenge to the adults who are trying to teach them and to guide them. As you know, our basic framework is that of the Newfound developmental paradigm, a comprehensive, broad paradigm that allows us to really see our children in 3 dimensions. And it is very much augmented by all of the research that is happening out there. And there is so much research going on. I truly wish that we had at the Center of Excellence a whole team of researchers who could go out and find things for us and bring them together, distill them to the essence. But we do the best we can to share what we've run across. And his basic paradigm looks at the development of human potential, which we call maturation. How does that come about? And of course, one of the things that we know is that in order to grow, you have to be soft. Any of you who've planted a seed, you know that that shell has to come off before the growth can happen. But when the shell comes off, we now have vulnerability. Vulnerability is not easy to tolerate. It's not a condition that it's something where we can get hurt, but we have to have that in order for the growth to happen. So how do we tolerate vulnerability? Well, that is in the context of a safe and caring attachment. And underlying all of this is a world of emotions that basically moves us towards the maturation that arise as a result of our vulnerability, that arise as a result of our attachment, and they basically, we have to respect them and understand them in the whole picture of the students that we're talking about.
And so when we're talking about the sensitive child, sometimes the first thought that comes to mind is students on the autism spectrum disorder, but it is so much wider than ASD. In my private practice, I work a lot with parents who have children who are on the gifted spectrum, and I mean, all of that is a spectrum, right? Between the sensitivity, the hypersensitivity, the giftedness, the autism, and there's a range there. And so all of that fits into this category of the high sensitive child, the highly reactive child, or at the opposite, the slow reacting child. Oftentimes, when they're little, especially, we see the shy child, the preschooler, those that may have sensory processing issues, that tend to be easily anxious, that can be oppositional or explosive. And Eva, to go back to your previous slide, I was just making a link as I was hearing you speak about how all of these different things, from the attachment, the vulnerability, the emotions, how particularly challenging it is for those sensitive children. I know that Deborah McNamara had written an article about how attachment is more difficult for a child who's sensitive. It is more tentative because it requires more vulnerability, and it's difficult for them to allow themselves to open up and to be vulnerable. We also know that a child who's gifted, for example, that yes, they're very bright and they're very intense, but there's a huge gap between their cognitive brightness, but their maturation in terms of the emotional maturation. And we see this as they're growing up. You see the gap that widens much more. The intensity is there to create more defenses, and so vulnerability is more difficult for those students. And so we really see at all of those levels the challenges for sensitive children. And so when we're talking about sensitivity, we thought it'd be important to make the distinction between the hyposensitive and the hypersensitive, because of course, students can be, or children can be, of either or, and actually could be of both as well in different areas. And so understanding the difference, hyposensitive is under sensitivity, where a student may need more input. And those are sometimes the students that we see that when they're lining up tend to get really close in other kids' bubbles and don't understand the personal space. They need that physical input in order to feed into this need to make sense of their world and to make sense of their body. That they get hurt and don't realize that they're getting hurt. They may seem clumsy or disorganized. They have a very low body awareness. Underreactive to sound and underreactive to touch. And to the opposite of that, of the spectrum, the overly sensitive, the hypersensitive child, who is extremely sensitive to touch, to taste, to all of the senses, to hearing, to smell. And we'll look on the next slide that there's more than just these 5 senses. There's really 8 different types of different senses. And the hypersensitive child, has a pain threshold that it's much lower. They feel pain much more intensely. That they may be choosy about fabrics. I remember my daughter is in the hypersensitive, and socks, having the, how do you call that? The threading was so difficult for her to feel on her toes, and to be able to find the right sock to fit on her feet was just
the seam. Yeah,
the seam. Thank you. Is so tricky for a child who's sensitive to the touch. That can startle really easily. That react to stress. The stress response on a very high level, where they don't tolerate, stressors in the same way as a neurotypical child. And so I mentioned that there's not just five senses, there are really truly 8 different senses. And so I'll go through each. The olfactory is really the sense of smell, to be able to recognize information through your nose. Tactile is through the sense of touch, receiving information through the skin. So it's not just with the touch of the hand, but any part of the body with the skin. Proprioception is the awareness of your body in space, and strength is needed to complete actions. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Eva, this is also what's, oh no, it's actually vestibular. That's in terms of the balance. It says it right there. The gustatory is so the sense of taste through the mouth, through the tongue, and being able to sense your world through that. The interoception, that's one that we don't speak of as much. And so the interoception is the sense of your internal body. So this is where you feel temperature, if you're hot, if you're cold, if you have a tummy ache, if you're hungry, if you have a pain in your body. This is where it plays out in the interoception. The vestibular is actually with the Eva, what is that called? With the drums in the ear, the
inner ear.
Yes, exactly. And so this is what helps in order with the balance and having a spatial orientation of your body in space. The auditory, of course, is through the ears, and so sensing your world through the senses of hearing. And the last one is the visual through your eyes, through your sense of being able to see with your eyes. And so all of these play an impact. And of course, a child who's hypersensitive or hyposensitive may not be hyper and or hypo to all of them in the same way. You could have a child who's more hypersensitive to, let's say, auditory, but the opposite for touch. And so this is where, you know, as we get to know the child and make sense of where their challenges are and in which degree, we really can't take for granted that each hypersensitive child is identical. They each have their own challenges unique to themselves.
Yeah, and when we're talking about sensory issues, of course, the true experts in that area are the occupational therapists.
Correct.
Some of our school boards have the good fortune to have occupational therapists who can help with students that have particular needs in the sensory and often the sensory integration area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so research has been done on this, and actually it's gone back for 100 years. We've always known that there are more people that have more sensitivities. And when we talk about sensitivity, we're not just talking about necessarily the downside of it, but it generally, over time, it has been understood, and now the research shows that about 15 to 20% of the population. Carl Jung in the 1920s basically said exactly that there are some people who are more sensitive than others, and this sensitivity interacts with their experiences and how they see the world. And the thing about it, and we'll look at this in a moment, is that basically, depending on the conditions that you face as a highly sensitive person, it can either work against you or work for you, because ultimately these traits are traits that we want as human beings. And so with a nurturing upbringing, many of these people become quite exceptional. And this is what our newer researchers, the big name in this is Thomas Boyce. He wrote a book, and I will be putting together a list of resources that I haven't had a chance to do, called The Orchid and the Dandelion. He and his colleagues, a number of his colleagues, have done all sorts of research to try and determine what these things are. And they found this subset of children that they are calling orchid children. And the reason they say orchids is because anyone who has tried in their home to take care of an orchid, it is somewhat different than taking care of regular plants. I am not very good at taking care of orchids. My daughter happens to be an orchid whisperer. But there is a particular way of taking care of orchids that you have to do. And when you do, they are beautiful. And this is the same thing with these particular children. They have this exceptional biological sensitivity that we've just talked about to their social environment. So as Catherine mentioned, it has to do with interactions. They've actually been able to measure cortisol levels. So they just take the saliva, giving them normal stressors, asking them to just make a phone call to somebody, to imagine giving a talk in front of strangers. And they measure, and they found for 15 to 20% of the children that they looked at, that some of them produce this extra level of cortisol. As a result, of course, it can cause different kinds of problems, illnesses, and developmental disorders. But these same characteristics, again, are helpful, or can become something quite wonderful. And as Thomas Boyce says, they can really blossom into extraordinary people, but we have to be very careful about the conditions that we place them in. And this is why when we're looking at these children in a classroom, there are certain things that we need to be doing. Another woman who's quite big in this area is Elaine Aron. She has a number of websites. One of them is about highly sensitive people. She focused a lot on adults, but she did some of the work on children as well. And again, describes them as being shy or fussy, having sensory processing sensitivity, startling easily, sensitive to pain, bright lights, et cetera, and tending to notice, but they also tend to notice more about the people around them. So they notice things, they're sensitive to things, but they get easily overwhelmed as well. And Jelena Obradovic, who's also another one of the big researchers in the area, they're the kind of children that if you approach them too quickly or make a loud noise, you do get fussy and irritated. So Elaine has put together a whole list of questions that she would ask a parent, because we all know that within the same family, you can have 2, 3, 4 children, and one of them might be one of these kinds of children. And I know for myself right now, I'm not going to read the list, you guys guys can read it for yourself. But right now, this is one of the big questions that often now comes to my mind, or has in fact for quite a few years, when parents will, be bemused or upset or wondering about a child who's actually developed quite a few behavior problems. And that they, but my other two, I remember one dad coming and saying, but my other two children were fine. His adolescent was in a program for quite severely, adolescents with a lot of difficulty. Part of my response initially was to just say, well, yeah, okay. But then I realized, if he was able to raise two children who did really well,
Mhm.
was his third child one of these highly sensitive children? And it's interesting, as we unpacked it, he was a very enthusiastic man, but his enthusiasm was too much for his third child, and it caused all sorts of ripples and repercussions.
Mhm. Deborah McNamara is another author who's written quite a bit on sensitivity. One of her editorials is called Sense and Sensitivity. I wanted to read this sentence. So while no two sensitive kids are alike, their enhanced receptivity to sensory information leaves them without a skin against the world. Things can feel too much, too big, too cold, too loud, too hot, too smelly, too painful, and too overwhelming. In other words, they can easily feel bombarded by stimuli, and this can stir them up emotionally. They are also likely to be more activated and reactive in environments that stir up their senses.
Which, of course, unfortunately, is a classroom very often, or a school.
Totally. And so another way to look at it is going back to the brain and making sense of the physiological piece really helps in this type of information that we're looking at, and understanding that it's not that the child is choosing to be picky or wanting to be difficult. There really is, in terms of on a physiological response, something that's different for those atypical children compared to the neurotypical. And so one of the things that we've realized as a neuroscience has developed is that there's such a thing called a sensory gating system. And the sensory gating system, typically its main role is to be able to filter out all of the external stimuli. And so, you and I, who may be neurotypical, are able to focus on one thing and cut out the background noise or cut out some of the movement that's happening around us. But a child who's hypersensitive doesn't have the same capacity to filter out in the same way. It's almost like as if all of it comes at once in a huge wave, and it can become quite overwhelming, quite intense. And they don't get to pick and choose what it is that they filter out and what they don't. There really is an issue in terms of the filtering system. And the other piece to add on to that as well, I almost call this kind of like the double whammy, is that above and beyond the fact that the sensitive child has a hard time filtering out the sensory input, they're also children who, for them, it takes them longer to mature because of the intensity of the emotion. And we know with neuroscience, with the prefrontal cortex development, that the prefrontal cortex is a second layer of filtering. And so even if there's, for a neurotypical person who is overwhelmed by a specific situation, let's say they're in a public place and there's a lot of noise, we're still able with our prefrontal cortex to find our way to temper ourselves and to temper the emotions. But a young immature child, or a child who's not well developed and has that overwhelm plus the lack of the prefrontal cortex, now has this double lack. And so we could really see with this imagery, it's just the visual makes a difference. You could see the quantity of input that is, we call this the leaky attention in the child who has sensory gating problem compared to those who have a well-functioning sensory gating system.
Yes, and then when when that happens, as Deborah McNamara mentioned, the child gets stirred up. Well, then what happens next? Well, the brain is kind of saying, oh, there's stuff going on. And as we all know, we have this alarm system that's mediated by our limbic system. And most of you should be quite aware of this right now. But again, the three key parts, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus, basically get activated. So the amygdala basically says, oh, there's something going on. The smoke detector, it's either a very sensitive smoke detector, or in this case, there's a lot of smoke coming in, right? So the amygdala might be fine, but the smoke is coming in. Too much stuff is coming coming in. The amygdala says, oh, we got to take care of this right now. Interacts with the hypothalamus, which basically orchestrates the response, and it links to the nervous system through the pituitary gland. And of course, it's the sympathetic nervous system that gets activated, and we'll see in a moment what results in that. And then don't forget, we always have our hippocampus, which ideally should be transferring things from short-term memory into long-term memory, consolidating our learning. But if the whole limbic system is preoccupied with an alarm, then the hippocampus is busily trying to figure out what it is that's alarming, and then we end up with memory problems and other kinds of functioning problems as well. And so when the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, we have the cortisol, the adrenaline, the norepinephrine, the growth hormone. These affect our blood vessels, our heart rate. The blood diverts to the muscles, which causes a lot of activity, and there's a lot of problems with the stomach. And of course, this is meant to go up and down, but when you have a sensory gating system that's not working properly, you are going to be inundated with these. And that's exactly what they found, that it took less for these particular children to cause an increase in the cortisol. So they had this unpleasant feeling inside of their bodies, and so it can cause quite a vicious circle. And so we come down to basically this interaction, and it's always about an interaction. It's about what the child brings to the environment. And as I say, Thomas Boyce named these children with the high sensitivity, orchid children. There's also another group of children that he calls dandelion children. So their sensitivities seem to be less, and there's nothing wrong with dandelions. By the way, we need dandelion people in the world. They are the ones that can cope with all sorts of things. So there's nothing wrong with one or the other. This is not a judgment. But with our orchid children, their sensitivity can come from genetics. As Dr. Newfound says, we're all princes and princesses, and we're looking for our match, our intellectual match or whatever, and it's sensitive people marrying sensitive children, sensitive spouses, and producing sensitive children. So we tend to we're kind of moving towards that, at least in certain segments of the population. Also other things like autism spectrum and so on, the number of genetic factors that can be there. What happened during the pregnancy? I know with one of my children, I was quite stressed during the pregnancy, increased her sensitivity, and what happened at birth. And then, of course, what happened in the child's life. So if you come highly wired, then it takes very little separation. It can take a mother who is depressed for a couple of weeks after the baby is born for a very sensitive child to notice that there isn't eye contact. A dandelion child is going to look around and find somebody else's eyes to catch. Not a problem. So again, we sometimes say, well, not much has happened in this child's life. But unfortunately, for a highly sensitive child, it doesn't necessarily take very much, or a sense of shame, or a sense of alarm. And I go back to the third child of that family. The dad was like gung ho, let's go play soccer, let's join scouts, let's join this, let's join that. And the little guy was like scared, and the dad was disappointed. Now he felt shame because he couldn't please his dad. Now he felt alarm, and it just caused kind of a downward spiral for that particular child, while all of those interactions worked marvelously well for the other two children.
And so in terms of the challenges for sensitive children, as Eva, through the neuroscience has explained, the senses do get very easily overwhelmed. And of course, if the senses get easily overwhelmed, school can be quite difficult for them on a few levels. I think, first of all, on the sensory stimulation level, for sure, having, big classrooms and with the neon lights and with the noises that are around and during transitions, it's a lot for them to manage. But also, talking about the fact that they're very perceptive and that they will see things or anticipate things and create for themselves, some separation and have an emotional overload as well. The brain quickly goes to sympathetic nervous system more easily, which can result into alarm and anxiety. The brain sets up defenses to cope with the being overwhelmed by the sensitivity. So it's kind of like, a bit of a snowball effect. And then the behavior challenges arise from the overwhelmed senses and the defendedness. And this is where the staff, are confronted with the hedgehog type of behavior, right? With the prickly, and how for those who have never touched a hedgehog, you actually cannot just hold it up. You can't just grab it, because of course you'll prick your fingers. And so knowing which is the best way to create that sense of rapport and safety with the animal, and sometimes treats will, of course, will help with that, for them to open up. I've seen a video where the hedgehog is completely closed, and then you just dangle the little worm in front of the face, and whoop, it opens, right? And to finding that way in.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so what happens is, and we're not going to read every one of these because this is a compilation of many kinds of behavior issues. But what we have to understand is that they will have some behavioral manifestations. Now, some of them, it will be clearly obvious that they're in distress. They'll show us that they're upset. You can see on their body that they're not quite getting it. Again, we haven't really talked a lot about muscle tone, but there's muscle tone. So sometimes they look different enough that we get, oh yeah, right, there's really something going on with this child. But for some of them, and I have a particular example in mind of a story that was shared to me by a dear friend of mine about a young child that she knew, who right from about 1.5 to 2 years old started having all sorts of problems. Again, came from a lovely family, not any trauma in the story at all, but the reaction, unfortunately, was quite an intense reaction. They called this child willful and stubborn. Can you imagine? You're 1.5 years old or 3 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You're overwhelmed by everything. You're trying to manage a world that's not working for you, and people call you willful. Oh my goodness. And so we get everything from struggling to come into the classroom, getting upset for no reason, rushing out of the room, running and hiding, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, Catherine, if you want to highlight any other ones here,
Well,
but
I don't have any specific manifestations that I want to highlight, but I did want to mention, to kind of make a nuance here, that it's happened in my experience in my private practice, where parents have come to me a bit discouraged, where, the school says that, there's nothing wrong with the child at school and they're doing really well, and yet they're a completely different person at home, and how, the child is capable to manage to some extent at school, but then falls apart when they get home. Or I've seen the opposite happen too, where schools are like, we don't know what to do with this child, and the parent says, well, I don't see this at home. And so, sensitive children can have somewhat of a capacity, because of the alarm or the pursuit, to kind of keep it together for a certain amount of hours, but then completely fall apart, whether it's, their safe places at home, or whether they can't because they don't want to disappoint mom and dad, and they let it out elsewhere. But this is where, sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint these children, because they don't show themselves, right? They have the mask on.
yes, and actually there are some adults, when you talk to them, say, "Oh yeah, I was one of those children, but oh no way I was going to let anybody know." So I just kept really quiet and I just did the best I could. But it's exhausting to
Yeah.
have to hold it together all the time,
Mm,
and so it can come out, and some, of course, can hold it in, and it's not a choice. We have to be very, very careful about that. It's not really a choice, it's a pattern. I have 2 children, and my son was one of these. I wish I had known about this when he was little, because he did hold it together. My daughter, more of an explosive child and had tantrums, all I knew there was trouble for her. I didn't know there was trouble for my son. And so it's but again, at some point you start to see little signs that
mm,
maybe the world is too much for the child.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, so what you end up is kind of, again, this vicious circle. So the high sensitivity, uh, and possibly defendedness, so this ability to kind of hold it in for a while, could result in irritating behavior. And then we get impatient, or give discipline. And again, I'll go back to the case of the third child. I don't believe these parents disciplined him harshly at all. But I know the father was extremely disappointed, because for him, doing things with his son was very important. So the impatience that he had towards his son,
mm,
which again, if he had only known, because once we talked about it and he realized it, literally within 2 weeks, he changed the way in which he interacted with his son, now taking into account the son's sensitivity. Literally within 2 to 3 weeks, the whole interaction between father and son changed.
mm,
But until you know that, you get
right.
stuck in this vicious circle that goes round and round. And
Indeed.
inadvertently, we end up with these children having bigger problems than they needed to have.
Yeah, and you know, Eva, just to go back so yes, it can be adult impatience, but it can also be adult alarm, where we get triggered or overwhelmed by some of these concerning behaviors. I remember just recently, I had a client that came to me. The son was huge rituals of washing the hands and reorganizing the house, and obsessive and having to start over if it wasn't done in a certain sequence. And the concern with the mother, the alarm of the mother to see the son, and the child could feel the mom's alarm. And so trying to work at helping mom to take a step back and looking at the bigger picture, and to be able to ground herself, to be able to ground her son. And it's so opposite to traditional psychology, where it's about, no, it's about trying to control the symptoms, right? Trying to get for the hand washing or the rituals to stop. And mother was so thankful, because after few weeks, even less than few weeks, the behavior stopped. Behavior stopped. And so sometimes it's our own alarm, the energy. They're so sensitive, they pick up on that energy from us.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So the irony of it is, when they become adults, these are the kind of people we want to interact with. We want people who are sensitive to, oh,
Mm.
you're not feeling well today, can I help you? We want those kind of people. But as young children, that can be overwhelming and can cause, as you say, exactly
Mm-hmm.
that vicious circle. Once again, explaining the difference between, or highlighting the difference between, a developmental approach, which says, give it time, allow a bit of maturity,
Mm.
come alongside, support, provide the attachment in the way that the child needs it, change will happen, right? Rather than focusing on the symptoms. So it's really
Mm.
the adults who have to change, and the children will come along, right? Yeah, so when we are intervening with this highly sensitive child, and again, by the way, both Catherine and I are very, very aware of the fact that if you are a classroom teacher, you've got many, many other students that you have to deal with. So we're not saying to you that you're going to be able to do everything that these
For sure.
children need, obviously, but maybe in the back of your mind, if there are little things, and this is what we're going to present in the next little bit, are some little things that you can do in the classroom that might make a difference. So once again, we always start with the relationship, remembering that there is sensitivity. So maybe there are some tools that can help this child regulate, or get that sensory situation sort of more manageable for them, that we need to compensate for the immaturity or the lack of capacity, because they need help from the outside world to deal with an inside world that's somewhat predictable or overreactive. And we need to be patient with their sensitivity, with their defenses, and so that we can protect their vulnerability. Many, many people who both Catherine and I were looking at different books, and the word always is, when you're interacting with these kinds of children, you have to be very, very careful that you do not use any kind of harsh reaction to it, because that just is too much for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really want to remember, first of all, we're not going to toughen them up, although we can we're going to help them to get more manageable. Like, it's not that we're not going to do anything for them, but just kind of being tougher isn't going to do it. We have to remember that when the brain is at rest, then it grows, and that
Mm.
prefrontal cortex will finally develop enough to be able to help handle some of the other things that are going on. We do need to keep an eye to the stimulation, or the amount of stimulation, and constantly remember that play, expressive arts, movement, and nature are particularly beneficial for these kind of children. And again, there's a whole books on nature deficit disorder, which again, many of these children, it's quieter out in the woods. There's all sorts of other healthy things that can help the whole system
Mm.
find a level of calm. So just remembering again to cultivate that relationship, but you have to do it very gently, very quietly, so you just find some way to just show your warmth, just maybe with your eyes, do something pleasant together. Again, not a lot of, oh, wonderful, this is great, because again, even praise can make these children feel
Mm.
overwhelmed. Collect before you direct, get a little indication. You've got the eyes, a smile, and a nod. And once in that connection, they can follow you. Just redirect them very gently. Provide the time for reaction. Um, as you can tell, I talk very quickly. With certain people that I know that are highly sensitive like this, I have had to slow down my rate of talking and my expectation of reaction,
Mm.
because it takes a while for everything to get processed. And remember that even attachment can actually be somewhat overwhelming. So everything has to be somewhat low key for these kinds of kids.
And so, again, this is an article by Deborah McNamara. The title is "What Sensitive Children would Like You to Know About Them." And so these are some of the highlights from that editorial. Their head can be very busy processing their world. And so because their head is busy, they may not always be focused, right? Especially when we're talking about being attentive in classroom. They're more prone to feeling stronger emotions when stirred up by their world. Relationships with others can take additional time to create because of the sense of vulnerability, not wanting to open up in that way and to trust and to take the risk. They are prone to feeling coerced and are more likely to resist other people's agendas. And it's not because the person on the other end is necessarily trying to impose or put pressure. This is, again, the typical sensitive child or the gifted child who anticipates or has their own views of things and twists it from their own perspective and then react to that. And of course, how structure and routine provides safety and security, and how central this is for sensitive children. And so some examples of tools. And so figuring out which sensory tool works best for the student. Of course, we talked about hyposensitive versus hyper, and we talked about 8 different senses. And so not all sensory tools are equal, and to be able to, with the student, to explore different ways and different materials and different timing also makes the difference, to make sure that we see what works for them. To create a sensory retreat for the student. And the idea here, I always see this as twofold. I think on the first fold is about how can we try to minimize some of the input for them so they aren't overwhelmed? And on the second hand, how can we allow for some opportunities for them to release some of that pent up tension from the overwhelm? And so it's kind of like that twofold, including sensory breaks as part of the school day, providing choices for sensory input opportunities, making sensory activities fun and engaging, and helping the students to recognize their internal cues and when they need a break. And of course, this is something that's a work in progress, because even us, the adults, don't always pick up on the cues of the child. And so it's for us to work together on this. And so here are examples of fidget tools. There's so many, there's such a variety. And so I invite you to go and take a look at a place like FDMT, for example, and see what's out there. Of course, fidget tools are, and the title says it, tool, it's not a toy. And so how can we introduce those properly to students and that they understand the benefits of them? Because sometimes even if they have the tool, but they're not using it properly, they're not benefiting from the gains of it because it's not being used correctly. And so introducing it is vital, explaining and modeling how the intended purpose of it is, and to make sure the student understands that it's not a toy, that's a tool, to explore with the student their own sensory preferences, to set up parameters and clear expectations around the what, the when, the where, and how long. For example, a stool that moves, I've seen students that kneel on them, that are, use them actually quite dangerously. So we need to be careful about safety measures, and explaining to them that if they having a hard time using it correctly, maybe it's not the tool for them, or maybe it's not the right time, and we need to go use that at another time. Setting up an individual bin for that student. Eva will talk more about, or I don't know if it's you or I that will talk about bins in a moment, and materials to select for that bin. And of course, safety, reminding and coaching students about these different tools and how to use them in a way that is safe.
There's the bin.
So it is me. And so the personal bin can contain such a variety of different things, from fine motor activity, it could be paper, crayon types of things, coloring, mandalas and all that, but it could also be that there are fidget tools that are in there. And the idea there is that it's mobile, and so the student can take it, and if they're not able to stay in the classroom, they can bring their bin with them wherever they go and use it there. The point of it is to engage the student, to give it when they're in a moment of respite. And it's also there for it to be to take, you know, like if ever they need a break from learning from academic pressures, that, you know, I mean, of course there's still a learning component to some extent in some of the activities that could be put in there, but there's a play component to it too, and so it makes it much more engaging, and as I mentioned, it's easy for them to transport it from one location to another. For those who have hypersensitivity to either sound or that need to be grounded, having things like noise canceling earphones, weighted items are helpful. Having privacy carols or what we call privacy dividers or folders that could help to minimize some of the visual stimulation that's happening in the classroom for the student. The neon lights, we know now, both with the sound, apparently the sound of neon lights, especially for an autistic child, is excruciating, and the brightness of the light. And so here's an example. This is something you could buy off of Amazon, and you could just stick it on top in order to filter some of the lighting. Having a variety of different workstations. We know for students who have a hard time staying in one position, you know, in a regular chair, for example, that this really helps to remove pressure from the body. Remembering that overstimulation for a student is not just about what is being told to that student, it's also their experience on a sensory level with their bodies. And so to be able to have some movement, to be able to stand or to, you know, to sit on the floor makes all the difference. And the same thing with different seating options. There's such a variety of those. I mean, it's more and more popular now in classrooms and at school. And so I continue to encourage you to try out different ones, because again, like Fidget Tools, they're not all beneficial to all students. And so it's about trying and seeing what works. Quiet corner. And so this is another one where in the classroom, so as a stepping stone before they leave the classroom, that we're able perhaps to have them stay in the class, but have a break from the group where they're able to have some sort of cocoon. And there's such a variety of different ways that we can create a quiet corner in the classroom. It just helps to kind of limit filter some of the stimulation. Now, this is a technician at one of our schools at Riverside that came up with this during COVID, because the space where she had the sensory material couldn't be, we couldn't have all different bubbles come to the one place. So she created a mobile quiet corner where the student could go underneath with the cover and the flashlight and have different types of materials, fidget tools and whatnot. And this has worked tremendously. The students are loving this.
Yeah. I remember one school even just by chance happened to have big cardboard boxes in the hallways, and the children like to go into those as well. So it's amazing. Children will use what we provide for them, and it does help break down the stimulation. We also remember that classroom breaks are important, and we've been stressing this since the beginning of the pandemic, where all of our alarm has gone up. I think many of us, if we hadn't already thought of ourselves as sensitive, know probably what it feels like to be a sensitive child when there's too much information bombarding us. So if we can have, you know, some kind of breaks where we incorporate movement, we know that the research tells us that the brain functions better when there is regular movement. In fact, a big study in Gatineau that is encouraging schools to do provided and have found good results in terms of academic performance. So it helps children stay on task, increases their attentiveness, and restores their energy and motivation. But you need to be sensitive, because some kids just love the big, loud, noisy, dancey kind of a thing, and for others, it's a different kind of a break. Sometimes it's even just going into the corner and doing a little bit of pencil work or coloring or whatever. So you need to be somewhat sensitive to that. But I think if movement helps all of us when we are feeling that bit of too much going on inside of our system, too much adrenaline and cortisol, as do the kinesthetic pathways. And of course, our very physically active students are going to hop and jump. But for the ones who have this, and again, these have often been created by with the input of an occupational therapist, and a lot of them do that large kind of pushing against things and pulling. In fact, I know that Eastern Township School Board, over and beyond the kinesthetic pathways that they've put into their schools, they actually in some of their schools have large muscle or movement rooms, again, where a lot of this sort of pressure can be taken out for these children. So again, we're not we're not occupational therapists. If you have a child who has particular sensory issues contributing to their sensitivity, please try and find an occupational therapist to help if there isn't already one. But all of these things can be modified to the needs of these particular kinds of children. Sometimes, as you know, life gets hard for them and it gets hard for you as the adult. When it seems like, you know, you've got some stuff that you have to do and it's noisy in your classroom and this student is kind of shutting down or tuning out or whatever, getting difficult, find some way. Is there someone we can send them to? That's why the quiet area is there. Or can we send them to somebody with a task, a book or an envelope, you know, counselor, support worker, technician, somebody in the school, or ideally, of course, to the nurturing support centers where we have the possibility of quiet and a chance for the whole thing to come down. Basically, the bottom line is that just to always make sure that we let the student know they're not being sent away from us and that we want to have them back in the classroom.
Of course, in terms of sensitivity, how can the adults compensate? And part of that compensation is about, for us, the adults, to anticipate what potentially could trigger them. And so when sensitivity can be overwhelming for those students, one of the ideas is to provide advanced notification. Surprises are very difficult for hypersensitive children. Having the unpredictability is difficult to manage. And so when we know there's going to be a change in a routine or the schedule, or there's a special event coming up, or there's going to be a new adult that will come into the space, for example, a substitute teacher, to well in advance give a notification to the student, a heads up that this is going to happen. This really makes such a difference for hypersensitive children. It allows for them to get used to the change and likely not have an overreaction to when it will come, because they know now that it's coming. And so another way to help compensate for the sensitivity is for us to keep in mind, when are those times that it triggers them? Where are those times, with who? And so when we're thinking about, you know, transition times, recess, break, you know, being able to give them that extra supervision or an organized activity, because something that is more unstructured is difficult for them to handle. Hallways can be very difficult. I know of teachers that they've waited for the students to either go before the group or after the group to get dressed and undressed to go outside. Same thing with the bathroom, not going necessarily without supervision, or and that they need some accompaniment, or that they don't go with a big group of kids because it's overwhelming. At lunchtime, it could be, especially if you have a big cafeteria, that's you know, the echo is very difficult in the gym and in the cafeteria, that they have a more quiet space. And with the substitute teacher, again, that they're told ahead of time, or that they could hopefully be introduced if that's possible. And so work with your school team to change the circumstances, right, rather than trying to control or change the student. And so the idea here is to prevent from problematic situations to trigger the child. And so another piece here is that it's that fine line, it's that dance. And with every child, it's different. To ask yourself the question, how much do I push? How far do I push? Or where do I maybe step back a little bit and try to protect, because we know that the child will just fall apart if we push them too hard. We know for a child, it's already hard to be confronted with a difficult situation. We're just adding yet another stressor if we're pushing them into it. And so being sensitive to that, recognizing when the child has reached their limit and that they're being stirred up, and that they need for the pressure to be removed. But at the same time, not overprotecting them either, and encouraging them to at least try challenging activities in small steps and increments. Because at the other end of the spectrum, if we can continuously protect them, then they may feel that we don't think they can do it, or they may not find the confidence in order to realize that actually they can do it. They just needed to give it a try. And so to remember that these children experience higher levels of cortisol levels to normal stressors compared to other children, and that we need to help them to tolerate the level of stress, but not too much at once.
And of course, we know there's going to be possibly a reaction to, you know, something will happen. There might be a meltdown. There might be, you know, unpleasant words or whatever, overreaction. It's just normal. This is what will happen. And so again, as with all of our children who experience difficulty, we always need to let them know we're going to take care of them. We're looking forward to. We're going to do the extra to hold on to them. And so we might not in that moment, be able to fix what was going on, but we always want to give them hope. We'll try again tomorrow. And so that is really important. Makes the child feel not so ashamed of the sensitivity that they've experienced and the overreaction that they might have had. Again, important to work with a school team. We have these students. What can we do for them? What else can we do? I remember one particular child, very sensitive, really could not tolerate having a substitute teacher in the class. And we were in a discussion. It just happened to be the day before, and the teacher said, "Oh my goodness, I'm not going to be there tomorrow. And it's popcorn day, and he's going to have a meltdown because he always had a meltdown around popcorn day, even with her." He says, "If there's a stranger in my room, he's going to really have a hard time." And I think the little guy was in grade 2, and the grade 1 teacher said, "Well, he knows me. He can come to my room." Right? So how else can we find support for these children? How can we take responsibility? What kind of resources can we use? I mean, we've had the caretakers who sometimes take some of these children under their wing. Is there another program? Is there someplace that we can send them to just give them that little bit of a break and to share the responsibility for a child, again, who might have some challenges that are difficult for us as the adults? Ultimately, of course, we want to remember our basic intervention principles, which are preserving the attachment, maximizing the relationship, compensating for the sensitivity, protecting the vulnerability, providing for emotional expression and play. These are all things that are very healing for everyone. And remember that when we work with the behavior at its roots, the change is going to be long lasting. This is the development will happen when development happens, things get better. We're running really, really short of time here, so just want to remind you that we have the website. You can find all sorts of information there. Catherine's going to work this summer on kind of bringing it all to one place, but on the resource list that you have at the end of the handout, you do have all of the links that will bring you to the different, I'll show you what it looks like, will bring you to the different places where you can find more information on the things that we have shared today. We did have a couple of case examples, but we will let you read them because we do want to have at least a couple of minutes for any questions that those of you that are attending live can ask us. And by the way, we will appreciate your feedback. I sent you out the survey in the email, and it's also on our website.
Yes.
And we have 2 bonus PD sessions, simply because these are sessions that we would like to record and have available on our site. One on play and emotion, but that's going to be on a Tuesday and not on a Thursday, on the 7th of June. And then on the 16th, people have been asking for, well, could you just do something relatively quick about what a developmental approach is? And so I will be presenting that on the 16th of June.
Wonderful. I'll just stop the recording and then we'll answer questions.